Good evening, friends, and welcome to Sleepy Time Tales, a podcast aimed at helping you to get a good night's sleep. Do you find your mind troubled with the stresses of modern life, especially when the lights are out and you're trying to get a restful night? Does your spinning mind keep you awake? Follow my voice down the path towards a good night's rest. Listen to me tell a story that will keep your mind from wandering to your daytime problems. The ones you can't solve right now and will be easier to solve well rested. Listen to my voice and allow yourself to drift, following the twists and turns of the story, but slowly letting go and drifting into sleep. Let my voice wash over you at a comfortable volume and allow yourself to be distracted from the stresses and worries that play on your mind. Whether you need help falling asleep or going back to sleep in the middle of the night, you can trust me to keep you company and help you to wake up tomorrow in a rested state. You may need to try out Sleepy Time Tales for a few nights to get used to this slightly strange idea, but I believe it will be well worth your while. I'm here to work with you, to create a safe space, a cocoon in which you can curl up and allow nature to take its course. So settle down, relax, and allow yourself to get lost in my telling of tonight's story. Before we get to tonight's reading, I'd like to ask for a few minutes of your time. Sleepy Time Tales is purely a listener-supported podcast. I can only keep it going, paying for the services and tools I use, and justify the time that I use on it thanks to the generosity and support of listeners like you. So if you're finding Sleepy Time Tales useful, if it helps you to get a restful night, and you'd like to help me keep it going out to thousands of insomniacs just like you, please consider supporting on the Patreon at patreon.com/sleepytimetales. This is monthly support that helps me keep the lights on and also gets you fun bonuses. So go along there, take a look and sign up if you're interested. And if you're curious as well, I do have a 7-day free trial on the $5 a month level, so you can see what the bonuses are that you can get for your, $5 a month. And if monthly is a big ask, which I can completely understand, you can make once-off tips to the tip jar on the website. And also, if you would like to help out Sleepy Time Tales but would rather not do it financially, you can also just tell people about the show. If you know someone struggling to sleep, recommend it to them. Suggest they try it for a few nights before giving up and see where they go from there. And that's enough of that. Let's get to the adventures of Bellarion the Fortunate. We return this week to Bellarion the Fortunate by Rafael Sabatini, and we pick up where he, as an orphan, was picked up by some very friendly soldiers. Later that day we came to a town whose inhabitants regarded us in cringing awe, but perhaps because its numbers were small, the troop bore itself with circumspection, careful to give no provocation. The man-at-arms who had befriended me kept me in his train for a month or more. Then the exigencies of the campaign against Moria demanding it, he placed me with the Augustinian fathers at the Grazi near Sigliano. They cared for me as if I had been a prince's child, instead of a stray waif picked up by the roadside. Thereafter at intervals he would come to visit me, and these visits, though the intervals between them grew ever longer, continued for some 3 or 4 years, after which we never saw or heard of him again. Either he died, or else lost interest in the child he had saved and protected. Thereafter the Augustinians were my only friends. They reared me and educated me, hoping that I would one day enter the order. They made endeavors to trace my birthplace and my family, but without success. And that, he ended, is all my story. Ah, not quite all, the friar reminded him. There is this matter of your name. Ah, yes. On that first day when I rode with my man-at-arms, we went to a tavern in the town I mentioned, and there he delivered me into the hands of the taverner's wife to wash and clothe me. It was an odd fancy in such a man, as I now realize, but I am persuaded that whilst he rode that morning with my little body resting in the crook of his great arm, he conceived the notion to adopt me for his own. Men are like that. Their natures made up of contradictory elements, and a rough, even brutal soldier of fortune, not normally pitiful, may freakishly be moved to pity by the sight and touch of a poor waif astray by the roadside. And on that he fell to musing. But the name, the friar reminded him again. He laughed. Why, when the taverner's wife set me before him, scoured clean and dressed in a comely suit of green cloth, not unlike the suit I am wearing now, for I have affected green ever since in memory of him, and of the first fair raiment I ever wore, which was of his providing. It may be that I presented a comely appearance. He stared at me in sheer surprise. I can see him now, seated on a three-legged stool in a patch of sunlight that came through the blurred glass of the window, one hand on the knee of his booted leg, the other stroking his crisp black beard, his grey eyes conning me with an increasing kindliness. Come hither, boy, he bade me, and held out his hand. I went without fear or hesitation. He rested me against his knee and set a hand upon my head, still tingling from its recent combing. What did you tell me is your name? He asked. Ilario, I answered him. He answered a moment, then a smile half scornful broke upon his rugged, weather-beaten face. Ilario, thou, with that solemn countenance and those big melancholy eyes. He ran on in words which I remember, though I barely caught their meaning then. Was there ever an Ilario less hilarious? There is no hilarity about you, child, or ever has been, I should judge. Ilario, Bellario rather, with such a face. Is he not a lovely lad? He turned me about for the approval of the taverner's wife, who stood behind me, and she, poor woman, made haste to agree, with fawning smiles, as she would have agreed with anything uttered by this dread man who must be conciliated. Bellario, he repeated, savouring the word of his invention with an inventor's pride. That were a better name for him indeed. And by the host, Bellario, he shall be renamed. Do you hear me, boy? Henceforth you are Bellario. Thus, he explained, the name so lightly bestowed became his own. And later, because of his rapid and rather excessive growth, the monks at the Grazie fell into the habit of calling Bellarioni or Big Bellario. It still wanted an hour or so till noon, when the twain emerged from the forest onto the open road. A little way along this they came upon a homestead set amid rice fields, now denuded, and the vineyards where men and women were at the labours of the vintage, singing as they harvested the grape. And here Bellarion had an instance of how the little brothers of St. Francis received alms, without being so much as put to the trouble of asking for them. For at sight of the friar's grey frock, one of the labourers, who presently announced himself the master of the homestead, came hurrying to bid them stay and rest and join the household at dinner, of which the hour was at hand. They sat down to rough, abundant fare in the roomy kitchen, amid the members of that considerable family, sharing with them the benches set against a trestle table of well-scoured deal. There was a cereal porridge, spread like a mortar upon a board, into which each dipped a wooden spoon. And after this came strips of roast kid with boiled figs, and bread moist and solid as cheese. To wash all down there was a rough red wine, sharp on the palate, but wholesome and cool from the cellar, of which the friar drank over copiously. They numbered a round dozen at table, the old peasant and his wife, a nephew and 7 children of full age, 3 of whom were young women, which were overly busy about Bellarion for his ease. Once, across the board, he caught the eye of the friar, and about these and the fellow's loose lips there played a smile of sly and unpleasant amusement at Bellarion's uneasiness under these feminine attentions. Later, when Friar Sulpizio's excessive consumption of wine had brought a flush to the cheekbones of that pallid face, and set a glitter in the beady eyes, Bellarion caught him pondering the girls with such a wolfish leer that all his first instincts against the man were roused again, and not the thought of his office or the contemplation of his habit could efface them. After dinner, the friar must rest a while, and Bellarion beguiled the time of waiting, which was also the time of siesta in which all labour is suspended, by wandering in the vineyard whither the peasants' daughters led him, and where they engaged him in chatter that he found monstrous, tedious, and silly. Yet but for this and the fact that the vineyard bordered on the road, Bellarion's association with the friar would have ended there, and all his subsequent history must have been very different indeed. The minorites' siesta was shorter than might have been expected, and when something less than an hour later he resumed his journey, so confused was he by sleep and wine, that he appeared to have forgotten his companion quite. Had Bellarion not seen him striding away along the road to Casale, it is certain the young man would have been left behind. Nor did he manifest much satisfaction when Bellarion came running after him. The scowl on his face argued displeasure, but his excuses and his explanations that he was but half awake permitted the assumption that it was himself with whom he was displeased. He moved briskly now, swinging his long legs in great strides, and casting ever and anon a glance behind him. Bellarion offered remonstrance at the pace, a reminder that Casale was but some 2 leagues away, and they had the afternoon in which to reach it. "If I go too fast for you, you may follow at your leisure," the friar grumbled. It was for an instant in Bellarion's mind to take him at his word then, partly perversity and partly a suspicion which he strove in vain to stifle, overcame his natural pride. No, little brother, I'll accommodate my pace to yours as befits." A grunt was the only answer. Nor, indeed, although Bellarion made several attempts to resume conversation, was there much between them thereafter, as they trudged on in the heat of the afternoon along the road that passes the fertile plains from Trino to Casale. They did not, however, proceed very far on foot, for being presently overtaken by a string of 6 or 7 mules with capacious panniers slung on either flank, the leading beast bestridden by the muleteer, Bellarion received another demonstration of how a little brother of St. Francis may travel upon charity. As the column advanced upon them at a brisk trot, Friar Sulpizio stepped to the middle of the road, with arms held wide as if to offer a barrier. The muleteer, a brawny, black-bearded fellow, drew rein within a yard of him. "What now, little brother? How can I serve you?" "The blessing of God upon you, brother. Will you earn it by a little charity besought in the name of Blessed Francis? If your beasts are not overladen, will you suffer them to carry a poor footsore Franciscan and this gentle lad into Casale?" The muleteer swung one cross-gartered leg over to the side of the other, and slipped to the ground that he might assist them to mount, each on one of the more lightly laden mules. Thereupon, having begged and received Friar Sulpizio's blessing, he climbed back into his own saddle and they were off at a sharp trot. To Bellarion, the experience of a saddle, or what did duty for a saddle, was as novel as it was painful, and so kept his thoughts most fully engaged. It was his first essay in equitation, and the speed they made shook and tossed and bruised him until there was not a bone or muscle in his body that did not ache. His humour too was a little bruised by the hilarity which his efforts to maintain his seat excited in his two companions. Thankful was he when they came in sight of the brown walls of Casale. These surged before them almost suddenly in the plain as they took a bend of the road, for the city's level position was such as to render it inconspicuous from afar. The road led straight on to the San Stefano gate, toward which they clattered over the drawbridge spanning the wide moat. There was a guardhouse in the deep archway, and the door of this stood open, revealing some 3 or 4 soldiers lounging within. But they kept a loose and careless guard, for these were peaceful times. One of them, a young man in a leather hackaton, but bare of head, sauntered forward as far as the doorway to fling a greeting at the muleteer, which was taken by the fellow as permission to pass on. From that gateway, cool and cavernous, they emerged into one of the streets of the busy capital of the warlike state of Montferrat, which at one time, none so distant, had bidden fair to assume the lordship of northern Italy. They proceeded slowly now perforce. The crooked street, across which the crazy houses seemed to lean towards each other, so as to exclude the sunlight from all but a narrow middle lane, was thronged with people of all degrees. It was ever a busy thoroughfare, the street of San Stefano, leading from the gate of that name to the cathedral square, and from his post of vantage on the back of the now ambling mule, Bellarion, able at last to sit unshaken, looked about him with deep interest upon manifestations of life, known to him hitherto through little more than the imagination which had informed his extensive reading. It was market day in Casale, and before the shops the way was blocked by trestle tables, on which the merchants displayed their wares, shouting their virtues to lure the attention of the wayfarers. Through this they came by low and narrow archways, to an even greater bustle in the open space before the cathedral. Founded, as Bellarion knew some 700 years before, by Luitprand, king of the Lombards. He turned to stare at the Roman architecture of the red and white facade, flanked by slender square towers, each surmounted by a hexagonal extinguisher roof. He was still considering the cruciform windows when the mule halted and recalled his attention. Ahead of him, Friar Sulpizio was slipping to the ground, bestowing thanks and invoking the blessings of God upon the muleteer. Bellarion dismounted, a little stiff from his ride and very thankful to be at the end of it. The muleteer flung them a God guard you over his shoulder, and the string of mules passed on. "And now, brother, we'll seek a supper, if you please," the friar announced. To seek it was natural enough, but hardly, thought Bellarion, in the tavern across the square, whither he was led. On the threshold, under the withered bough that was hung as a sign above the portal, the young man demurred, protesting that one of the religious houses of the town were a fitter resort, and its charitable shelter more suitable to a friar mendicant. "Why, as to charity," quoth Friar Sulpizio, "it is on charity I depend. Old Benvenuto here, the taverner, is my cousin. He will make us free of his table and give me news of my own folk at the same time. Is it not natural and proper that I seek him?" Reluctantly, Bellarion was forced to agree, and he reminded himself, to buttress a waning faith in his companion, that not once had he voiced a suspicion of the friar's actions, to which the friar's answer had not been ready and complete. Chapter 3. The Door Ajar. The event which was to deviate Bellarion so abruptly and brutally from the peaceful ways of a student and a scholar, and to extinguish his cherished hopes of learning Greek at Pavia under the far-famed Messer Chrysolaris, was upon them so suddenly and so unheralded that he scarcely realized until it was overpast. He and the friar had supped in the unclean and crowded common room of the hostelry of the Stag, so called, it is presumed, in honour of the lords of Montferrat, who had adopted the stag as their device. And it is to be confessed that they had supped abundantly and well under the particular auspices of Sir Benvenuto, the host, who used his cousin Friar Sulpicio with almost more than cousinly affection. He had placed them a little apart from the noisy occupants of that low-ceilinged, grimy chamber, in a recess under the tall, narrow window, standing open, so that the stench, compounded of garlic, burnt meats, rancid oil, and other things, which pervaded the apartment, was here diluted for them by the pure evening air. And he waited upon them himself, after a protracted entertainment with the friar, conducted in a mutter of which nothing reached Bellarion. He brought them of his best, of which the most conspicuous item was a lean and stringy fowl, and he produced for them, from the cellar, a flask of Valtelline, which at least was worthy of a better table. Bellarion, tired and hungry, did justice to the viands, without permitting himself more than a passing irritation at his companion's whining expositions of the signal advantages of travelling under the aegis of the Blessed Francis. The truth is that he did not hear more than half of what Friar Sulpicio found occasion to urge. For one thing, in his greed, the friar spoke indistinctly, slobbering the while at his food. For another, the many tenants of the inn were very noisy. They made up a motley crowd, but had this in common, that all belonged to the lower walks of life, as the loud, coarse speech, freely interlarded with blasphemy and obscenity, abundantly bore witness. There were some peasants from Romaglia or Tuscella, or perhaps from Terranova beyond the Po, who had come there to market, rude, brawny men for the most part, accompanied by their equally brawny, bare-legged women. There were a few labourers of the town, and others who may have been artisans, one or two of them, indeed, so proclaimed by their leather aprons. And at one table a group of 4 men and a woman were very boisterous over their wine. The men were soldiers, so to be judged at a glance from their leather hacketons and studded girdles with heavy daggers slung behind. The woman with them was a gaudy, sinuous creature with haggard, painted cheeks, whose mirth, now shrill, now raucous, was too easily moved. When first he heard it, Bellarion had shuddered. She laughs, he had told the friar, as one might laugh in hell. For only answer, Friar Sulpicio had looked at him, and then veiled his eyes, almost as if himself he was suppressing laughter. Soon, however, Bellarion grew accustomed to the ever-recurring sound, and to the rest of the din. The rattle of platters and drinking cans, the growling of a dog over a bone it had discovered among the foul rushes rotting on the bare earthen floor. Having eaten, he sat back in his chair, a little torpid now and drowsy. Last night he had lain in the open, and he had been afoot almost since dawn. It is little wonder that presently, whilst again the taverner was muttering with his cousin, the friar, he should have fallen into a doze. He must have slept some little while, a half hour perhaps, for when he awakened the patch of sunlight had faded from the wall across the alley, visible from the window in which they sat. This he did not notice at the time, but remembered afterwards. In the moment of awakening, his attention was drawn by the friar, who had risen, and instantly afterwards by something else, beyond the friar. At the open window behind and above Friar Sulpicio there was the face of a man. Upon the edge of the sill, beneath his face, were visible the fingers by which he had hoisted himself thither. The questing eyes met Bellarion's and seemed to dilate a little. The mouth gaped suddenly. But before Bellarion could cry out or speak, or even form the intention of doing either, the face had vanished. And it was the face of the peasant with whom they had dined that day. The friar, warned by Bellarion's quickening stare, had swung around to look behind him. But he was too late. The window space behind was already empty. "What is it?" he asked, suddenly apprehensive. "What did you see?" Bellarion told him, and was answered by an obscenely morphological oath which left him staring. The friar's countenance was suddenly transfigured. A spasm of mingled fear and anger bared his fangs. His beady eyes grew cruel and sinister. He swung aside as if to depart abruptly, then as abruptly halted where he stood. On the threshold surged the peasant, others following him. The friar sank again to his stool at the table and composed his features. "Yonder he sits, that friar rogue, that thief," thus the peasant as he advanced. The cry, and more than all, the sight of the peasant's companions, imposed a sudden silence upon the babel of that room. First came a young man, stalwart and upright, in steel cap and gorget, booted and spurred, a sword swinging from his girdle, a dagger hanging on his hip behind, a little crimson feather adorning his steel cap, proclaiming him an officer of the captain of justice of Casale. After him came two of his men armed with short pikes. Straight to that table in the window recess the peasant led the way. "There he is. This is he." Belligerently he thrust his face into the friar's, leaning his knuckles on the table's edge. "Now, rogue," he was beginning furiously, when Friar Sulpicio, raising eyes of mild astonishment to meet his anger, gently interrupted him. "Little brother, do you speak so to me? Do you call me rogue? Me?" He smiled sadly, and so calm and gently wistful was his manner, that it clearly gave the peasant pause. "A sinner I confess myself, for sinners are we all. But I am conscious of no sin against you, brother, whose charity was so freely given me only today." That saintly demeanour threw the peasant's simple wits into confusion. He was thrust aside by the officer. "What is your name?" Friar Sulpicio looked at him, and his look was laden with reproach. "My brother," he cried. "Attend to me," the officer barked at him. "This man charges you with theft." "With theft?" Friar Sulpicio paused and sighed. "It shall not move me to the sin of anger, brother. It is too foolish, a thing for laughter. What need have I to steal, when under the protection of St. Francis I have but to ask for the little that I need? What use to me is worldly gear? But what does he say I stole?" It was the peasant who answered him. 30 florins, a gold chain, and a silver cross from a chest in the room where you rested. Bellarion remembered how the friar had sought to go slinking off alone from the peasant homestead, and how fearfully he had looked behind him as they trudged along the road until overtaken by the muleteer. And by the muleteer it would be, he thought, that they had now been tracked. The officer at the gate would have told the peasant of how the friar and his young companion in greed had ridden in. Then the peasant would have sought the muleteer, and the rest was clear. As clear as it was to him that his companion was a thieving rogue, and that his own 5 ducats was somewhere about that scoundrel's person. In future he swore he would be guided by his own keen instincts, and the evidence of his senses only, and never again allow a preconception to befool him. Meanwhile the friar was answering. So that not only am I charged with stealing, but I have returned evil for good. I have abused charity. It is a heavy charge, my brother, and very rashly brought. There was a murmur of sympathy from the staring, listening company, among whom many lawless ones were, by the very instinct of their kind, ready to range themselves against any who stood for law. The friar opened his arms, wide and invitingly. Let me not depart from my vows of humility in the heat of my own defence. I will say nothing. Do you, sir, make search upon me for the gear which this man says I have stolen, though all his evidence is that it chanced to be in a room in which for a little while I rested. To accuse a priest, said someone in a tone of indignation, and a murmur arose at once in sympathy. It moved the young officer to mirth. He half swung on his heel so as to confront those mutterers. A priest, he jeered. Then his keen eyes flashed once more upon the friar. When did you last say Mass? Before that simple question, Friar Sulpicio seemed to lose some of his assurance. Without even giving him time to answer, the officer fired another question. My name? The friar was looking at him from eyes that seemed to have grown beadier than ever in that white, pitted face. I'll not expose myself to ribald unbelief. You shall have written proof of my name. Behold. And from his gown he fetched a parchment which he thrust under the soldier's nose. The officer conned it a moment. Then his eyes went over the edge of it back to the face of the man that held it. How can I read it upside down? The friar's hands, which shook a little, made haste to turn the sheet. As he did so, Bellarion perceived 2 things. That the sheet had been correctly held at first, and that it was his own lost letter. He had a glimpse of the abbot's seal as the parchment was turned. He was momentarily bewildered by a discovery that was really threefold. First, the friar was indeed the thief who had rifled his scrip. Second, he must be in a more desperate case than Bellarion suspected, to seek to cloak himself under a false identity. And third, the pretense that the document proffered upside down was a test to discover whether the fellow could read, a trap into which the knave had tumbled headlong. The officer laughed aloud, well pleased with his own cleverness. I knew you were no clerk, he mocked him. I have more than a suspicion who you really are. Though you may have stolen a friar's habit, it would need more than that to cover your ugly, pockmarked face and that scar on your neck. You are Lorenzaccio de Trino, my friend, and there's a halter waiting for you. The mention of that name made a stir in the tavern, and brought its tenants a step closer to the group about that table in the window recess. It was a name known probably to every man present, with the single exception of Bellarion, the name of a bandit of evil fame throughout Montferrat and Savoy. Something of the kind Bellarion may have guessed. but at that moment the recovery of the abbot's letter was his chief concern. "That parchment's mine," he cried. "It was stolen from me this morning by this false friar." The interpellation diverted attention to himself. After a moment's blank stare, the officer laughed again. Bellarion began actively to dislike that laugh of his. He was too readily moved to it. "Why, here's Paul disowning Peter. Oh, to be sure, the associate becomes the victim when the master rogue is taken. It's a stale trick, young cockerel. It won't serve in Casale." Bellarion bristled. He assumed a great dignity. "Young sir, you may come to regret your words. I am the man named in that parchment, as the abbot of the Grazie of Sigliano can testify." "No need to plague Messer the abbot," the officer mocked him. "A taste of the cord, my lad. A hoist or two and you'll vomit all the truth." The hoist? Bellarion felt the skin roughening along his spine. Was it to be taken for granted that he was a rogue, simply from his association with the spurious friar? And were his bones to be broken by the torturers to make him accuse himself? Was this how justice was dispensed? He was bewildered, and as he afterwards confessed, he grew suddenly afraid. And then there was a cry from the peasant, and things happened quickly and unexpectedly. Whilst the officer's attention had been on Bellarion, the false friar had moved very soft and stealthily nearer to the window. The peasant it was who detected the movement and realized its import. "Lay hands on him," he cried in sudden alarm, lest his florins and the rest should take flight again. And, that alarm spurring him himself, he leaped to seize Lorenzaccio by arm and shoulder. Fury blazed from the bandit's beady eyes, and his yellow fangs were bared in a grin of rage. Something flashed in his right hand. It was a wicked, vicious upward thrust, like the stroke of a boar's tusk, and the very movement that delivered it flung the peasant off, so that it hurtled into the arms of the two soldiers, and momentarily hampered their advance. That moment was all that Lorenzaccio needed. He swung aside, and with a vigor and agility to execute, as remarkable as the rapidity of the conception itself, he hoisted himself to the sill of the narrow, open window, crouched there a moment, measuring his outward leap, and was gone. He left a raging confusion behind him and an exclamatory din above, which rang fierce and futile commands from the Podesta's young officer. One of the men-at-arms supporting the swooning body of the peasant, whilst his fellow vainly and stupidly sought to follow by the way Lorenzaccio had gone, but failed because he lacked the bandit's figure. Bellarion, horror-stricken and half-stupefied, stood staring at the wretched peasant, whose hurt he judged to be mortal. He was roused by a gentle tugging at his sleeve. He half-turned to find himself looking into the painted face of the woman whose laughter earlier had jarred his sensibilities. It was a handsome face, despite the tawdriness it derived from the raddled cheeks and two vividly reddened lips. The girl, she was little more, looked kindly concerned upon him out of dark, slanting eyes that were preternaturally bright. "Away, away," she muttered feverishly. "This is your chance. Bestow." "My chance," he echoed, and was conscious of the colour mounting to his cheeks. His first emotion was resentment at this misjudgment. His next, a foolish determination to stand firm and advance his explanations, insisting upon justice being done him. All this while he had flung his question, "My chance." With the next heartbeat, he perceived the strength of the appearances against him. This poor drab, these evil ones about her and him, offering him their sympathy only because they believed him made kin with them by evil, advised the only course a sane man in his case must follow. Make haste, child, the woman urged him breathlessly. Quick, or it'll be too late. And it looks like there's a very exciting chase scene coming up, so I'm going to call it there for tonight. As always, you can pick this up where I'm leaving off, if you find the original on Project Gutenberg at the link in the show notes. Thanks again for joining me on this episode of Sleepy Time Tales, the podcast designed around a bedtime story to help you to get a restful night. New episodes will be released every Sunday night to give you something fresh to help you rest in a new week. But make sure to follow or subscribe in whatever service you use so that you get your new episodes whenever they come out. Good night and sweet dreams.